Today is the 14th of October,
No, oh yeah.
2019, isn't it? Yeah. My name is Scott Brainerd. I'm a soon-to-retire research coordinator with the Division of Wildlife Conservation here in Fairbanks. I'm accompanied by Brad Wendling, sheep researcher, Graham Fry, moose and ptarmigan researcher, and Tom Paraguay, intensive management and habitat research biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and we're here to interview Joe Want on his career and experiences here in Alaska. So, welcome, Joe. We
Thank you.
appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So made me laugh.
So, yeah, we just want to, kind of hear a little bit about your background. Maybe you can just tell us, when and where you were born, your parents' names, and where you grew up. Anything you want to talk about in your early childhood?
Well, I was born in Palmer, Alaska, 1943. My grandparents moved to the valley in 1922. My mother was born in Juneau in 1921. So I spent all of my youth until I was 15 in Palmer, and my grandfather worked at Buffalo Mine as a blacksmith.
Okay.
And that's where my mother and my uncles were. My uncle was raised in one of my earlier. He had a house small log house, about 2 miles from Buffalo Mine, between there and Premier. My mother went to school at Premier in the in 1926 or 27. She started, which was quite a long before the colonists came, and they were serviced by the railroad, which hauled coal from the mine to Anchorage. She went to school at Premier in literally a small one-room cabin schoolhouse. And probably one of my earliest memories is my grandfather, who lived in a 2-story house, and I can remember the guns hanging from the rafters, and I can remember being intrigued by those guns when I was a very young, 5, 6 years old. And the other thing I can remember is that my uncle shot a sheep up Moose Creek, which I never saw, of course, but that was one of my earliest memories of hunting.
Where was that?
That was midway between Premier and Buffalo Mine.
Oh, okay.
And there was a small round, and I can remember playing there when they first put that road in, which was about 1948 or 48. I can remember driving up there and then playing. The other thing I remember, just as a short story, is that there was no electricity there, of course, and they had Coleman lanterns. And each night my grandfather would take these Coleman lanterns down, and they didn't, at that time, most people didn't leave a globe on them, even later on, just because there was always a fear of explosion, whether it was real or not. I don't know, because most of the claps didn't have globes on them. So each night my grandfather would take those down and set them on the windowsill. And one day I remember, I was probably about 5 years old, I got a pencil, and I touched one of those mantles. And when I touched it, it just disappeared. I was so fascinated with that. I can remember it like it was yesterday, and they were all double globes on those, double mantles on those. I remember I touched one, and I thought to myself, I won't do another one.
How old were you?
5.
Oh, wow.
And then I did one more, and it was so magical when they disappeared that when I got done, there were no mantles left. And I remember when my grandfather found that, he gave me a spanking, which at the time assumed it was probably one swat, but it was pretty terrible because it came from my grandfather. But I can remember thinking, he never once thought that Grandma might have done that. Which, I mean, there was always that possibility. Even at that age, I couldn't understand why he never asked if Grandma had done that.
So he's been a critical thinker. Yeah.
So growing up, what would young kids do for fun in Palmer back in the early 1940s? And how would you keep yourself entertained?
We had rock fights. No, I mean, rock fights, but nobody ever really got hurt. Played kick the ball. And then that was when I was really young, and then when I got to be in the 5th grade, I had saved up enough money to buy a .22, and I went down from Reed's hardware store. It was $16 and some odd cents. And then once I got that, then one of the things I remember was that I had a lot of guns when I was a kid growing up, toy guns. And I played a lot of cowboys and Indians. I mean, I was pretty busy at that. But when I got that first .22, all my toy guns were taken away. That was the end of it. There were no more toy guns.
How old were you then when you got your first .22?
I was in the 5th grade, so I was 16. No. No. I was like 11 or 12. And then shortly after that, I was able to start going camping. I worked at a place called Johnny's Surplus Store, and I would trade for like sleeping bag and a tent, stuff like that, on weekends.
You just go by yourself?
Yes.
When you were in the 5th grade?
5th and 6th grade. But things were a lot different then. I could hitchhike anywhere I wanted to go, and then once I got my bicycle, I could ride my bicycle, although most of the time I hitchhiked. But hitchhiking was very common then. All kids hitchhiked when you wanted to go
It
someplace.
was considered safe.
Oh yes. No, I mean, no one thought anything about it. Except one time, we were a little bit older. We must have been in about the 8th grade, 7th, 8th grade. Two of my friends, Jackie Harris, and I think it was and Henry Wright, and I were going to hitchhike up to Eska. But nobody would pick 3 of us up. So my buddy Donnie Harris said, we'll spread out. Of course, Donnie was the one that was going to stay there, and the other 2 of us had to walk, because that's the way Donnie worked. So we spread out, and somebody picked up Donnie. He's driving along. He said, there's one of my buddies. And so the guy stopped and picked him up. Come to the next guy. Donnie said, there's one of my buddies. Stopped and picked him up. Come to the 4th guy, who, I don't know who he was. He said, if that's another one of your goddamn buddies, he's going to have to walk. But then at that time, I got very interested in hunting. I spent a lot of time, almost every weekend, even in the wintertime, because by about 1957, my grandmother, who had a series of strokes, they moved back to town, and they lived in a house, and they had salvaged much of his house, and he still had a cabin that was my uncle's. They built it for my uncle. My uncle was in World War II, and then he never came back. He came back from the war, but he never moved back to Palmer. So that cabin was there, so on weekends I would hitchhike up there and spend my weekends in that little cabin. It wasn't a log cabin, it was a semi-modern, And then I spent almost every weekend hunting. And then in 1958, I went to work for Martin Grasser, taking horses from Chickaloon back to the Little Shetna. We were back there for 45 days. That was my first real experience in the quote-unquote outdoors. Wasn't a weekend camping trip.
So 1958 did that, so you were 15 years old.
Yes.
And so your parents, you left high school at that stage.
I quit school the next spring,
and
1959. Then I worked for him for 45 days, back in a guide camp. And I've said it often, one of the interesting things about that as I look back was that in 45 days, and it's about a 75-mile trip up Boulder Creek around the head of Caribou Creek, and then into the Little Shetna. And much of that is in a semi-alpine setting. In 45 days, I never heard a wolf, never saw a wolf track, never saw a bear track, never saw a bear. I mean, that was towards the, I don't know that it's directly associated, but it certainly was at the same time when the predator control was winding down the poisoning programs.
What were your impressions of ungulate abundance at that time?
I have no idea. I shot my first caribou, and they shot 3 or 4 moose while we were back there, and some caribou. So I mean, I don't know that they were abundant, but they certainly were there. And at that time, the Harrises and a number of other people from Eska were taking swamp buggies in back of Eureka. I mean, that was an annual, I'll call it like a pilgrimage
Pilgrimage.
That
too.
Thank you. Well, however it is,
Yeah.
they took an annual trip moose hunting in back of in back of Eureka.
What's a swamp buggy?
A swamp buggy it's a 4x4 with DC-3 tires on it. They were very common then, or a lot of people use them hunting those and weasels, military vehicle with tracks on it.
Right.
And some people had most people, there were very few horses. The only people that really had horses were outfitters like Martin Grasser and Harold Nichols and some of those individuals.
So the Grasser family was pretty instrumental early in your life.
Oh, very instrumental. I mean, Donnie Harris, who was Eddie Grasser is Donnie Harris's nephew. It was through the Harrises that I met Grasser, because Martin Grasser was married to Marilyn Harris, who was Donnie's sister. It was that was my association with Marlin, and through Donnie, because Donnie would spend weekends sometimes in town, rather than going back to Eska.
And they were guides?
Martin Grasser was a guide, yes. He started guiding in the mid-50s. In fact, that summer 1958, there was a rodeo came to Palmer, and it didn't do well. And he ended up buying the horses. Then he bought those horses, and we broke those horses that summer. And then he used them in his guiding operation that fall. He would take and tie a horse, snub it down to a big horse. He would ride the big horse, and then I would get on the one that wasn't broke. And when they're snubbed down like that, they can't buck. So he'd walk it around a little bit, and he'd gradually feed out the rope and the lead shank, and then got them to where we could ride them.
Did you ever get thrown?
Not that I remember, but I may have, and I just can't remember. I never got hurt, but it was quite a summer and quite an experience.
Did you repeat that, or what did you do after?
Well, I worked for him for one fall, and then the next spring I went to Olga Bay on Kodiak and with Pinnell and Tollefson. And that was, prior to that, my other association had been with Bob Burkholder. I had gone over and spoken with Bob Burkholder one time. He was with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I believe, and he had a small cabin over by Buggy's Field. And I talked to him about wildlife management.
In Palmer?
Yes.
Yeah.
And my other one was with Dr. Rausch. I had read there was an article in the newspaper, and I don't know why I read it, but it had to do with Echinococcus multilocularis. And I read that, and it fascinated me, so I hitchhiked to Anchorage, and at that time he worked for the health service, public health service. I found the place, and I went up and I talked to him for, it seemed like an hour or something. He was very engaging. So that was my first exposure to wildlife to wildlife biology.
Is that the same Bob Rausch that later came to Fish and Game?
No, this was R.L. Rausch.
Exactly.
R.A. Rausch is the one that came to Fish and Game.
Exactly, because he went to the university, didn't he, afterwards?
Yes, he worked at the university in Arctic Health for quite a while.
Right.
He had done a lot of work in western Alaska.
So that was your first acquaintance with a scientist?
Yes. And then when I went to Kodiak, because at that time the guiding industry had a pretty strong association with wildlife, especially the Fish and Wildlife Service, and Dick Hensel and Will Troyer were people that I spent when they would come in, everything was kind of different then. Everybody just had to talk on a kind of an equal level, or at least you were able to participate on an equal,
Even as a young guy, basically.
Oh yes, no, I mean the fact that you knew nothing had no impact on the conversations whatsoever, other than that you just couldn't make your points.
What were they like?
Who?
Troyer and Hensel.
Outstanding. It's hard to believe that present company accepted that you could find two better people to be exposed to initially in wildlife management or management issues, conservation, biology, the whole spectrum. They were very engaging and never made you feel like you were out of place when you were talking to them. Every question was answered with and dealt with a level of seriousness that is sometimes missing with people who have higher levels of education. And that just was not the case with them. Plus there was a lot of interaction between the guiding industry and biologists, at least the guides that I was associated with. We collected specimens, and we had jars of tapeworms, and we were constantly doing something.
So you were actually working as or volunteering with them? Or
With who?
With the biologists.
No, yes, from the guiding side, it was all done on a voluntary
So you were
basis.
bringing
You know,
specimens.
observations and collecting specimens,
Oh, I see.
especially tapeworms at the time,
Interesting.
or, internal parasites.
Were you involved at all in those early bear captures that they
No.
did? Do you recall how they did it?
Only from what I read, where they stick ether in a 5-gallon bucket and stick it over their head.
Were they in culvert traps or what?
No, that was before they were using culvert. They were using leg hole traps. That part I remember because one of the things that happened was over at Carlick Lake, there was Bob Raleigh. There was two. They had Camp Island over there, and you had the wildlife side of it, and the fishery side of it, and you had the wildlife side of it. And so they would bring their families down there in the summertime to Camp Island, and there was always a little bit of harassment going on between the two. So one day, I guess Hensel and Troy or two of them were in the boat headed down the lake, and they saw Raleigh and them coming, so they ducked down in the boat and made it look like a runaway boat. So then Raleigh and them raced and caught up to the boat. Then they jumped up and big ha ha hurrah hurrah, big laugh, So then Raleigh and them went down and they found all these bear traps are marked, So they went down and they got one of the bear traps and then a big potato fork, drug it and then dug everything up with a potato fork, scratched the trees and everything, and drug it up and hid it in the bushes. So then here comes Troyer and Hensel, and they find that. And of course, it's a very tense situation when you're going in like that. They had shotguns or whatever, and then they took, Raleigh and them took and put a teddy bear in it. So that pretty much ended the practical joke operation. But there was a lot of interaction between the guiding industry and, the managers at the time, which at that time, of course, it was the federal government. And then when the state took over, Sterling Idy was one of the first biologists down there, and there was that interaction carried on. And even when I first got out of the service, which I was in the service from 60 to 64, there was still a lot of interaction, positive interaction between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Department of Fish and Game. In that the Fish and Game office was, as some people thought was quite appropriate, it was in the old jailhouse. It was. And at noon, they would call, and everybody would jump in the pickup and run down and then have lunch down at the Belmont. Fish and Game and Fish and Wildlife, so like Hensel and Troy, and those things have, as you know, it's kind of changed. It's not the same between the two. There was a great deal of cooperation between the two. And as I look back, that's one of the things that I kind of miss now.
So were you in Kodiak right up to the point you went to the military?
Yes, I went to Kodiak in February of 59, and I went in the Marine Corps in September of 1960. And I was in for 4 years. And I took two leaves, a 60-day leave and a 45-day leave, and came back to Alaska and worked as an assistant guide because I was 19 then. And you had to be 19 to be an assistant guide. So I worked 2 years, 62 and 63 as an assistant guide. And then when I got out in 64, I took my guide exam. And then I went back to Kodiak and worked.
What were the guides like? How did they treat you?
The guides?
Yeah.
Oh, I was treated well as a guide. And even when I was at Olga Bay, it was the same thing. People participated in conversations everybody was more or less equal. Mm-hmm. No one said, well, it wasn't acceptable to say, well, I've been guiding for 25 years, so I must be right. It just wasn't accepted.
But how long had Purnell and Tollison been guiding in that area?
Well, at that time, they started in the late 40s. So they had been guiding 10, 12 years when I first was associated with them. They were older when they got started, older. Bill was, in 1960, they were 50 and 40 when they got started, which is, from a guiding standpoint, is older.
So it seems like with those early experiences, that you knew you wanted to be a big game guide.
Oh, absolutely. I can remember as about a 6-year-old boy, I was very young, 5, 6 years old, we were going up to Johnny Luster's place. Johnny Luster was a guide who used horses, and for whatever reason my parents knew them. And I can remember going up there, and we had like a 47 or 48 Chevy, whatever it was like a Suburban. And I can remember leaning over the seat and asking my dad what it took to be a guide at a very young age. And why I thought that that's what I wanted to do, I have not a clue. But I can remember specifically asking that question. I can specifically remember watching how he shifted that truck so that I'd be able to drive someday. But that's just the way my brain worked, I guess.
So that you were in the guiding industry, you knew you wanted to be a guide. Why did you enlist in the Marine Corps?
Because at that time, almost everyone went in service. It wasn't a matter of if, it was a matter of when. So by going in the military when I was 17, then that was quote unquote out of the way. Mm-hmm. It was something that you were going to do, and you were either going to do it when you were 17, 19, or 20. At some time you were going to go in. Plus my dad had been in the Marine Corps, and so I had kind of a feeling for that. And then there was a man by the name of Buster Barnhart. They had a sawmill down by Goat Creek, which is partway between Palmer and Anchorage, and he had been in the Marine Corps. Now why, we knew them, but I can remember him being in the Marine Corps. And then I remember another time seeing a Marine walking down the street in Anchorage. And those are just why, And then the other thing, I felt that if I was going to have to go into service, I really thought the Marine Corps was the best. It was the best trained. And if I was going to have to go into combat, that's where I wanted to be.
Why not the Navy?
Because my parents were married. I shouldn't have said that.
Where were you based, Joe?
Barstow, California. Right in the middle of the desert, the Mojave Desert. I was there for 43 months, or 42 or 43 months.
Did you learn any skills in the Marines, like marksmanship?
Marksmanship. I worked as a marksmanship instructor for 2 years, and in small arms repair. But the marksmanship instruction helped a lot, because prior to that, my shooting had been pretty much self-taught, which had all the problems of being self-taught with most things. And when I got there, one of the things, and I shot left-handed, but when I was in boot camp, they explained to me that there was no such thing as a left-handed shooter. And they just said there's no such thing as a left-handed shooter, so you shoot right-handed. So then I learned to shoot right-handed, which was obviously then I became ambidextrous at shooting, although offhand I preferred shooting left-handed, and then prone or kneeling I would shoot right-handed. But I spent a lot of time on the rifle range. In distance shooting, we shot up to 1,000 yards. And on the course, we were shooting 200 to 500 yards.
How did being in the Marine Corps influence your life after that?
Gave me discipline, which a lot of people would dispute. But it probably instilled in me that the ability to keep going when you don't think that you can, or when you feel like you maybe just want to quit or something. The attitude of, the importance of having a positive mental attitude towards anything that you, especially physical and probably intellectually, that you undertake. There's no such thing as quitting, just because you're quote unquote tired. And in fact, one of the things that was really impressed me, I think, was the ability to do things. They would much rather have a person who could only do 10 push-ups and would spend an hour trying to get the 11th push-up, as have somebody who could do 100 push-ups and then would quit. And that was a real underlying philosophy that they had. And that really impressed me. You know, the ability, even though you're tired, to keep trying, even though you're physically capable of, you know, which there are people capable of doing 100 push-ups, but they didn't care. They were more concerned about your attitude of not quitting and staying together. And the other thing that would impress me was that when we would go on field maneuvers, we'd go once a month. When we had a field mess, and we'd line up for a field mess, all of the privates went through first, then all the PFCs, then all the lance corporals, right up the line to where the last person to ever go through was the highest ranking officer there. And that really made an impression on me.
Going back to your time there on Kodiak, that early time there, were there any dramatic or interesting experiences that stood out?
Well, one of the things that happened was that the first winter I was there, I trapped. Yeah. And the whole process of trapping is it's an excellent environment for getting an appreciation of the environment and what goes on around you. You know, because you're interacting with it at a level that you often don't when you're hunting. I mean, because of what you can see and the time that you spend out. You know, you're out almost every day. And the importance of watching and observing. And the whole process of hunting, the way because we didn't use airplanes, there's a different level of hunting, not that it's better necessarily, but there's a different perspective of hunting when you're not using an airplane. It's the same with any kind of technology. You know, there's a different perspective of hunting when you use a rifle as opposed to a bow, you know what I mean, or the type of, all of those things contribute. And the lower that level of technology, the greater the interaction usually is with the environment.
What were you trapping?
Land otter. My first land otter I caught it down. Well, Bill and I went down Bear Creek and set this trap. We had like 10 or 12 traps out down there. The first time I went down, I got one land otter. I was by myself, and I remember worrying how I was going to get those other 9 land otter back that were in those other traps. 2 weeks later, we got the second one. But there was a lot of concern on that first one.
Who was Bill?
Bill Pinnell.
Okay.
So once you were discharged from the Marine Corps, what was the next step?
I went back to Kodiak, and I worked there for 2 seasons. And that fall was, for a while I had an inspiration for a career change. I thought I was going to fight bears for a living, and I had a 0-1 record and retired.
Can you elaborate, please?
Well, I was trapping, and we had just got done hunting. The last hunter was still in camp, but he was done, and it was on November 15th. And in camp, we had been talking. You're always talking about what's going on. And Morris had mentioned that there is a sow that's up by Eagle Creek, and she has some cubs, and they had seen her. And it just in the general course of the way you talk about things, I knew that, but I probably didn't pay as close attention as what I thought what I should have. So I went up. I had some traps up a place called Grass Valley. So I went up there and I checked those traps. And when I was coming back, it was right at dusk. I was walking pretty quickly, and all of a sudden I looked up, and here's this sow with these 3 cubs, and all 4 of them stood up and looked at me. And I yelled, and here she come. And we had these big tussocks there. There's places down there where those tussocks are like 2.5, 3 feet deep, and they're long troughs. So she come racing at me, and I jumped down in that tussocks, and I was laying under it like this. And she got a hold. We had these heavy wooden pack frames. And she got a hold of that, and she ripped everything off that, put big bite marks in it, then got a hold of my arm. And I got up and got her in a headlock. Nah, not really. Maybe not quite a headlock. But I laid under it real quiet, and then she left. The one thing I remember was seeing her face just right next to mine. And she was gone. She got a hold of the back of my arm and took some bite marks out of it. So then I was about a mile and a half or 2 miles from the cannery then. So when I got up, I got all my stuff because it was scattered all around, and I gathered it up and I put it under a bush and put my raincoat over it so I'd be able to find it. I mean, it's just how instilled you're about losing things, you know. I had a fox and a shovel and a bucket and a couple other things. Put my pack back on, and then I went up over the hill and got to camp. And when I got to camp, Bill was just going in between the 2 rooms in the house, and I told him I had to talk to him, because I didn't want to say anything in front of that other hunter, which wouldn't matter because he was done. So I got him outside, and I told him what had happened. He pushed me back in and told Joe's been mauled by a bear. It was pretty exciting, but I mean, there was nothing wrong with me other than I wasn't bleeding or anything. In fact, I had a couple heavy coats on, so I mean, I had bite marks in my arm, but it wasn't like it was dangling and blood dripping down or something. So they sat me down at the kitchen table, and the next thing we had these a big northern radio, and when you would turn those on, there's a winding sound when they revs up. So we heard that thing up there, and Bill was on the radio going, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday." And Morris runs in and grabs the microphone away from him, and but anyway, and Daryl Farman was there, and they looked at it and bandaged up my arm, and I went to town on Tuesday or something. They wanted to put stitches in it, but it already started to heal.
So was that a defensive attack then?
I haven't a clue as to what it
Were
was.
there cubs there?
There were cubs there.
Yeah. How old were they, do you know?
I don't know. They were cubs of the year, though.
Oh, okay. And did you have what was in your pack?
Just that fox.
Okay, yeah. Interesting. But she had her face right next to you.
Really close. I mean, I remember seeing her face.
But she didn't bite you after that initial.
Well, after she bit on my arm and lifted it a couple times. I mean, then she left.
This is after you were in the Marines.
Yes.
What year was that?
64.
Oh, so you just got out.
I just got out. I got out in September, and that happened on November 15th at 8:32 p.m. No, it was November 15th in the evening.
How far was she when she charged you?
Well, every time I tell the story, she keeps getting closer. And about every 4 or 5 tellings, I got to push her back out, you know, probably 40, 50 yards, just guessing. I mean, it wasn't like from here to the wall or something.
What kind of firearm did you have?
22. The rest of the winter, I had a 300 H&H.
So after that hunting season, is that when you made your first move up to Fairbanks?
No, I hunted seals that summer, and then when I got done hunting seals, I went over and I worked for a guide out of Anchorage, up in the Chugacks. I hunted sheep. That'd be the fall of '65. Then I went back to Kodiak, trapped, and then the next summer I hunted seals again. I hunted seals 65, 66, and 67. And during those winters, I trapped on Kodiak. I trapped in Terror Bay. I trapped one winter up in Shuyak, another winter in Terror Bay, and a winter in Olga Bay. And then I came to Fairbanks. That was kind of one of those things when the summer of '67, a friend of mine and I were walking down the runway, and he said, "You ought to go to Fairbanks and go to college." And I said, you know, that might be a good idea. But then I realized I never graduated high school, although I had a GED. He says, "Don't worry about that. They have to take you because you're a resident," which they did. So I came to Fairbanks and went to school for a year.
What was that like?
It wasn't very much fun for me or the professors. I was interested in wildlife management. So I thought I would be interested in biology, but it was the biology classes, I didn't like them.
Right.
Well, they weren't as open as what I was used to. You know, I remember one of the first labs that I went to in biology. He was a nice enough person, but he said something about all mammals have 7 cervical vertebrae. I didn't know it. I raised my hand. I said, "I don't think that's accurate." because a three-toed sleuth has 5. And he says, no, it does not. And he was pretty forceful about it. And that was reflective of the attitude from my perception. And that really turned me off as far as, I wasn't used to that. I'd never been in that setting where, except in the Marine Corps, which I accepted it there, but outside of that, where it was assumed that someone was right because of their position. I did much better in English in a couple other classes than I did in that one. And then I had another one, it was with Dr. Guthrie, where it was something about animal behavior. And I don't remember, it had something to do with a dog. When a dog bows its neck, that's because it's defying the other dog to bite it. And I had a Chesapeake at the time and had been around some sled dogs, and that just was not true. I mean, that dog fought all the time, and that's the last. And I said, I don't think that's, and it was pretty much the argument was that since Conrad Lorenz said that, it must be right. Well, that was and that, I didn't like that. I just was not, and am not used to discussing things in that way. So I moved on.
Well, something else happened in college. You're in a physical education class, right?
Oh yeah, I was in swimming and I met my wife.
For a pretty important change of events.
50 some years later, I met my wife in swimming. She didn't want to take swimming and I had to take swimming. So I met my wife and then the relationship developed and then we got married, and 50 years later we're still married. 3 children. And then about 1970, we decided we were going to start our guide business. I had worked in the Brooks Range, and I would go back and work on Kodiak, and I worked in the Brooks Range for Pinnell and Tolleson. So then I decided I would start my own guiding business. So then I had some experience in the Brooks Range, and it was in the Central Brooks Range, but I knew of some of the issues with working on the Central Brooks Range because it was on the north side. So I chose the Sheen Jack because it was a south-facing slope and it went deep into the range. And then I started booking hunts and went up there bear hunting in the spring and saw 3 or 4 sheep, so I knew I was in good shape. And went on. I was up there for 30-some years.
Did you have any prior experience hunting sheep?
Yes, I hunted sheep in '65 and '66 in the Chugacks for Jack Lee. You know, and then in 1958, when we were coming out, we were up Boulder Creek, and we were at a place called Kelly Camp, and Marlin took the hunter or 2 hunters out that day, and then while I was sitting there, I saw 3 rams up in a bowl, and I went up and looked at them, and one of them was a full cross. It was the first sheep stock I ever made. Of course, I wasn't hunting them, but I got really close, and that really made an impression on me.
Joe, can you share the story of the 2 brothers that you took in the Chugach?
Oh yeah, we had the first. I had hunted in the Brooks Range for, I don't know, at least 2 years. I guess 2 years I had hunted in the Brooks Range, and then in '65 I went to the Chugach for Jack Lee. And the first morning when we got up, we walked up on Upper Cayenne. We went from Upper Cayenne, and then they made an airdrop, and we went to this Iceberg Lake or whatever it was called. And we got up the first morning, and I was making sandwiches, and the hunters said, "Come over and look at these sheep." I went over and looked at these. I had never seen sheep that big in my life. I mean, it was just unbelievable how big they were. It would be the same. They asked how big they were, and I didn't have a clue because I had never seen sheep that large. So I went ahead and made the sandwiches. It'd be like me looking at a 12-foot bear. I wouldn't have a clue what the size of a 12-foot bear is because it's so much bigger than anything I've ever seen. So anyway, we made the stock. We went up and we spent the night, and then the next day we got around there and they were on this knob. I knew nothing about sheep hunting. At least I'll rephrase that. I didn't know near as much about sheep hunting as I thought I did. Anyway, there were two big sheep and we wanted to take them. So I thought, well, the best way to do this is I'll count to 3. So I had them all lined up and they shot, and those sheep started running around that hill. And they were kind of isolated on it. Every time they come around, I'd have those hunters shoot again. Shoot again. Absolutely horrible. But we got both sheep, and one of them was 45 inches on both sides, and the other one was 41 inches on both sides. That was one of those things that was I guess through my life, one of the things that I often think about is that, especially sheep hunting, I can remember a number of sheep hunting. I can remember when I had guided for 15 sheep. I can remember when I had guided for 30-some sheep. And I can remember when I had guided for 50-some sheep. And one of the things is that when I was I can remember when I had guided for like 14 or 15 sheep, thinking to myself, pretty well at the top of the ladder here. Not much to learn. And then I can remember at 30 looking back at 14 or 15 and thinking, man, I wish that wasn't a real bright move to do it that way. And then from 50, I can remember looking back at 30 and thinking, God, if I had that to do over again, I wouldn't have done it. And that's been a real lesson for me in life in that regards of how good I think and I think I'm pretty good at most stages. I'm never nearly as good as what I think I am. And I'm seeing the same thing with this sheep horn aging business. There was a time 3 or 4 years ago when I was pretty cocky about my age, and I'm not anymore. And the more I get into it, the more horns I cut, and the more I look at them, the more I'm convinced that there's a lot that we don't know. And it doesn't mean that the foundation is good, but applying those principles is not as easy as it appears to be. And I've really found that to be true with just about everything I've dealt with in life, regardless of how good I think I am. And I usually think I'm pretty damn good. When I look back further down the scale, it's a lot different than what I thought it was at that time. And there may be a real lesson there as far in life. Because I can apply that to gardening, I can apply it to everything that I've done. It's never complete. It's never time to move on. It may be time to use that as a foundation to build on, but it's never done.
So after you met your wife and you got out of school, did you stay in Fairbanks from then on?
Yes, okay. I lived in Fairbanks from then on. After I moved here in '67, I never left. I mean, other than to go work someplace, but I always lived in Fairbanks.
And then how long was it from then until you started your own guiding?
We started our own guiding business in '71, but taking hunters out in '72.
But in the meantime, you were working for other people?
Yes. And I worked in a lumber mill, felled timber a couple of years, a couple of winters and things like that.
So in your guiding career, I mean, it's not stated here, but oftentimes you would do a 200-mile trek from the Hall Road to the Sheen Jack and go to Kodiak. How that time away from your family, how did that affect your family? Or what was it like for you to be away from your family for those extended periods of time?
It was interesting because it kind of works two ways. There's an adjustment period when you come back and you miss your family, and then they have to adjust to your being back. In some ways, we joke sometimes we've been married 50-some years, but we've been together 28 years. I mean, there's no question that there is an adjustment, but it's not all negative. Sometimes when you're away, you appreciate things more when you come back than I think you do if you're there continuously. That was one of the things that happened when I went up there in the spring of '72, and then that fall I went up there hunting, and I knew that there were sheep there, and that's what I was primarily interested in. So it was a real learning experience. But then when I came out from that year, I stopped by Marlin's place, and we were talking about the Brooks Range, and he said something about horses up there. And I said, well, because I knew a little bit about it, I said, horses would work fine up there. He said, well, how would we get them there? I said, well, we could fly them. So, and the way Marlin works is, that sounds good to me. I had a couple of mules, and he had some horses, so we chartered an airplane in '73, or 73, I think it was, and flew them up to Arctic Village.
What kind of aircraft was it?
It was a big boxcar, flying boxcar. We had like 14 head of horses in there and all this gear. Landed at Arctic Village, and the whole village turned out. And when we dropped the back of the plane, boy, everybody's eyes just got really big. So we took all the horses out and all the gear. And then I spent like 4 or 5 hours giving everybody, all the kids in the village rides up and down the runway. And I flew them up there. I flew them in the next year. Next year, it only cost us $900 to fly them up and to fly them back. You know, 900 one way and 900 back. But then the next year, because of the pipeline, it went up to like 2,200. So then he didn't take them up after that. Excuse me, but I took them up one year. I used a boxcar. Flew them in and out with that. And then in '76, I took them in from the haul road. And then I had to fly them out though, because we couldn't, there's too much snow. And then in '78, I started going in from the Ribden River. That was shorter. It was that way. The first time it was about 240 miles. And then for a couple of years, and then when we started going clear up the Ribden River, it went to about 200 miles. And we did that, not every year, but for most of the years from them until about 94, 95, whenever it was.
You say you flew the horses out those first couple of years because of the snow?
Well, one year that in '76, I couldn't get back to the haul road, so I go to Arctic Village. And then they had a bunch of barrels there. You know, they have to put a deposit on those fuel barrels. So the council, we split the charter. So, and they were able to fly up the fuel, and I paid for the charter back. And then all the extra space we had, we put in empty drums. So it was real good for all of us.
How many horses?
That year I had like 4 or 5.
What about mules?
Well, mules and horses.
Okay.
I use mostly mules.
But you walked in from, where did you walk in from before the Ribden?
From the shelf. I went in one year from the Chandelar shelf.
Right. And
'76. That was a lot harder. There was a lot more tussocks and I didn't fly it or anything. I just looked at a map. I mean, so I could get through it. But there was a lot of tussocks and it was slow going.
And you were by yourself?
Yes.
How long did it take to get in there?
Well, that time it took, I think, about 18 days. Took a long time.
Were you mostly walking, or did you ride some?
I walked and rode that year. And then for a number of years after that, most of the time I'd walk.
And then your clients were flying in?
Then the clients would fly into camp, yes. And then at the end of the season, we'd walk back out.
At one point you mentioned your wife and children were with you at the camp.
They would fly in.
Okay.
They would fly into camp. They never made a trip in and out. On that trip, you're making 18 to 22 miles a day, so it becomes, it's not hard, but it's a routine.
So once you get done sheep hunting, walk back out to the haul road, there's a little bit of lag time, then you'd head down to Kodiak.
Right, I would be out for about a month, 3 weeks to a month. Then I would go to Kodiak in the fall, and I would be down there from about the 1st of October, 10th of October, 10th or 15th of October, depending, until early December.
So at that time at what point was there this transition where you started to develop this relationship with the department? Was it when you started weighing bears down there, or at some point?
It started before, a strong association with the department probably started when Tony Smith and Wayne Heimer, because of the sheep. They were heavily involved in sheep, and I was very interested in sheep. So and then when Dr. Zarnke was here, I collected serum samples for him. So there was just an ongoing, I was making counts. In fact, when I first wanted to take the horses up the haul road, they had the haul road there, so I thought, well, we can drive them up there. So I went over and I wrote a real nice letter to Alieska, and I can't remember the man's name now, and explained to him how I needed to use the haul road to take the horses up to the Chandelar shelf. And I thought it was a real eloquent letter. he wrote back a very short letter that said no. So I thought, well, that's because I didn't explain myself well enough. I'll go talk to him in person, and then he'll understand, and then I'll have my permit. So I went over, he was on Airport Road. So I went over and I went in and I talked to him and I explained to him, you know, why I needed to do this. And again, he said no. And he was pretty forceful about it in that he said the only 3 people that can use that haul road are Alyeska contractors, state contractors, and federal contractors. And it just wasn't real nice about it. I mean, it was just pretty forceful. So I said, okay. So Dick Bishop was the regional supervisor. So I came over and I talked to Tony Smith. And I said, you guys have no composition counts from the Eastern Brooks Range at all yet. You need them from the Sheen Jack. He said, yeah. I said, well, I'll do those for you for a state contract if you give me a contract to do it. I'll do it for nothing. So I explained to him why. So we went in, we talked to Dick Bishop. Dick said, that sounds good. So at that time, the state had just a little form you fill out. It looked like a form that you used to fill out at special services to check out a volleyball. It was like 4 blanks that you fill in. So I filled that out, and I had a contract. I go back over to the Alyeska guy, and I said, I wanted to pick up a permit. And he started telling me, I said, well, I'm a state contractor. And he was not real happy. So I got to eat. They had to give me the contract. I mean, they had to give me the pass. So they gave me a pass, and then that year I wrote up a report when I got done on the number of sheep that I'd seen and did composition counts, and I did that for a couple of years. That was probably my first strong association, although Tony and Wayne and I had, you know, had interactions with sheep because of the sheep that I was taking. Not that, you know, they were good sheep, and it was just, the Eastern Brooks Range was not being hunted very much at that time.
What year was it that you got that contract?
76.
76. Well, you and Tony did some sheep surveys together, didn't you?
Yes, Tony and I did a number of things together. we did surveys in the park, and then we did a little bit over in the Alaska Range, but mostly in the park.
The Denali Park?
Yes.
How did that work with the National Park Service?
Well, what would happen is that we would drive down there, and then we would drive through the park, and then we would get out and go. We'd see some sheep, and then we would go do a composition count on them. And then a couple of years later, I went down there by myself, and with park employees, and we would drive through it and look at sheep. One of the things that happened was because they had trouble getting permission to do that, and Tony said something to the effect, when you're down there, you need to impress them, which I took to mean that I didn't have to be fully forthright with them when I saw them. So we were driving along one day, and you're driving the same route day after day, and it's green, and it's in the summertime. And there was a hill that set probably 2-3 miles off the road. It's quite a ways off the road, though. And it's green. I mean, just a bright green in the summertime. So we're driving along, and since you're looking at it all the time, all of a sudden there were, I think it was like 3 white spots on that hillside. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out. And the guy, whoever was with me, said something. I said, because there's 3 sheep over on that mountain. And he says, no. So we put the spotting scope up. And when we put the spotting scope up, these sheep had, whatever it took us to stop, which wasn't more than a couple of minutes, these 3 sheep had bedded down so that all you could see was just a little bit of their necks and their heads sticking up above this hill. I mean, it was perfect. I said, I put the scope on, I said, there they are. He said, you saw those while we were driving? I said, I absolutely did. He says, there's no way. I said, how did I know there were 3 sheep there? Now, if he would have asked me, were they standing when you saw them, I would not have lied. But he never asked, and I never told. It was just perfect, because just in that minute or two, they all 3 bedded down, and now all you could see was just their little tiny heads and a little bit of their neck.
And they were rams.
No, I don't know if they were rammed. They were. I don't remember that. I just remember all you could see were their heads.
I don't want to interject too much, but I remember Tony Smith and I were in Dry Creek one time, and they're about 5 miles away. There were some sheep. He said, "You see those sheep over there?" And I said, "Yeah, they're rams." I'm like, "How do you know that?" He says, "I just do."
Well, that's Tony. Tony operated a lot that way. That's why he and I didn't always agree on things. I mean, it was just I'm not even sure how you describe it. It was just the way it was. I mean, when I was down there, he and I would go to the park, and he would fire me every day. Literally fire me every day. But I wouldn't quit.
The Marine training.
I wouldn't quit. And then by that night, everything was fine. Then the next day, midway through, he'd fire me again.
You weren't alone with that.
Huh?
You weren't alone with that.
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, it
That's
just.
the way he was with just about everybody. But yeah, he was a character.
But I had he was, even though he and I disagreed on things, I always enjoyed talking with him. Same with Wayne Heimer. You know, he and I certainly don't agree on, but I always enjoyed discussing and debating things with him.
Definitely a lot of passion there.
Yeah, well, and reason, although I don't always agree, which I guess doesn't mean that they're wrong, although in my mind, no. But it formed a premise or a basis for a lot of my attitudes towards wildlife and towards research, and in a positive way, even though I may have disagreed with them. And that was the same with, I felt throughout my association with the department, that's happened a lot, in that I come up with what I perceive to be a beyond brilliant idea, and then when I go in I talk to people, and then when I come out, there's only one way for it to go usually, but when I come out, I'm always much further ahead than I was to start with. And that's because of the quality of people that I've been able to associate with in the department, outside the department, and with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they've always, whenever there was something that I needed and I didn't understand, they've always been somebody that's been willing to sit down with me. When I started dealing with some bear data on Kodiak, I don't know much about it now, but I knew absolutely nothing about data, and I knew nothing about statistics. And at that time, the department was back in the bunkhouse. Dan Reed was back there. And I could go in with Dan Reed, and I'd ask him a question, and he would literally take me across the hall and sit down in my little chair, and he had a blackboard there. And he would explain it to me, and I would ask questions, and he could tell by the questions that I was asking how well I understood the concept. And once we got to a certain point, then I could move on. And that happened over and over again. That happened with Sterling Miller. It happened with Harry Reynolds. I mean, it happened with Wayne Heimer. It's been across the board. So it's been I don't know about a good substitute, but it's certainly been a substitute for formal education. Sterling Miller. I mean, there's a whole number of people that, Warren Ballard. I mean, it just goes on and on and on, the list of people who have been willing over the years to help me get over rough spots and or to understand concepts.
What other jobs did you do for Fish and Game, and when did you start working as a technician or on jobs for Fish and Game?
Well, I skinned wolves. The only other time I skinned wolves, and then I did that work on that survey work with Harry. I mean, with Harry Reynolds, I did some survey work in the Brooks Range, observation work on bears, and then I skinned wolves, and then the work that I did with Tony Smith.
You collected sheep too, didn't you, down in Ely or something?
Yes, that was with Tony Smith.
Right.
But I don't remember much about that because I made some mistakes, and all my mistakes I tend just to blot those out. Differentiating between ewes and young rams was not my strong point.
Oh, yeah, right.
In your time in the Brooks Range, did you have interactions with some of the research biologists up there for the Fish and Wildlife Service?
Very little. Very little.
Or how about university students?
A couple of university students, I somehow would help them with their, Kathy Kirby, she did some work on the Shinjek. I didn't help her so much as I gave her some, information about the area, some things like that.
She was working on sheep?
I think she was. They were going to set up something down by Double Mountain. She was up there for one fall that I remember. But on Kodiak, I did more with the Fish and Wildlife Service because of the bears and Vic Barnes. Vic Barnes and he was very good to work with, and Roger Smith, who was with the state. But Vic Barnes and Roger Smith had a very good working relationship. And that's where I did a lot with Vic Barnes as far as, I interacted a lot with Vic Barnes as far as weighing bears and gathering that kind of information. He helped me with, that process. What it was that we needed to do to gather that information.
These are on hunter kills?
Yes.
Okay.
Because we were cutting them up. I was cutting them up and weighing them and giving him that information.
Did you do any spring hunting there?
Yes. I hunted both spring and fall.
Yeah.
In the spring we started usually early April to the middle of May. In fact, we took a lot more bears in the spring. In the spring I would take 2 or 3, and then in the fall usually 1, once in a while 2.
But you'd go, when did you move, when would you walk into the Shinjek? When was that, roughly?
I would go in end of July, mid to late July we would start in.
Right.
You have any hunt that's like the most memorable to you? Or a hunter or a client?
No, I don't think so. I had a couple that were just really outstanding people to. One was Jacques Roussel from France. He was an older gentleman. He was in his early 60s, and he just had a phenomenal. He'd hunted in Africa, and he lived in Africa for quite a while. But he just knew a lot about wildlife. He was just a very enjoyable person to be out with. And a lot of the European hunters were that way, though. They had a phenomenal knowledge of wildlife. And it was, when you were talking to them, you would say something. You would mention a certain characteristic or an aspect of wildlife, and they would say, "Oh, that's just like the roe deer," or something like that. But as far as just one that really stands out, no. But I had a lot of hunters that were really good to be with. I had some that weren't, but usually when you look back on it, the circumstances, they spent a lot of money and a lot of time, and now it's getting towards the end of the hunt. And it was always interesting or amusing to me that at the beginning of the hunt you were beyond genius. The food is great, tents can't get any better, but then as this hunt goes on and days are ticking away and they're not successful, those evaluations start to deteriorate to where on about the 8th or 9th day, it's amazing you still have your license or how you ever got a license to start with, and equipment really needs to be replaced and there's not enough variety in food. That's at 8 o'clock in the morning, but at 9 o'clock after you shot something, you're back up to genius status. And that's a function of human nature, I think, more than it is of the individual.
Were the hunts longer in the old days or earlier in your career compared to toward the latter part of your career?
For us, they were the same because of the way we hunted. Our hunts were 10 to 12 days, and because of the way airplanes, the scheduling went, the charters were set up for every 12 days. So if they shot it on the first day, which was one of the worst things that could happen, then they were still there for the next 10 or 12. Different guiding operations do it differently, though. And especially now, I think there's more of a tendency, if they get it on the second day, they're gone. The hunters want to be gone, and it just works out better for everybody if they can be gone. But certainly over time, if you looked at the turn of the last century, early 1900s, those hunts were 30 and 40 days long, and in the late 1800s, they were 6 months. Take them 2 months to get there, month to get in, month to hunt, and then 2 or 3 months to get back home. That's all changed. And the amount of effort that people are willing to put forth has changed dramatically, I think. You know, 50 years ago it was a 15-mile or 20-mile day was nothing. A 15 or 20-mile day now is a lot more, it's considered to be more strenuous.
On those situations where you got an animal in the first day or two, for the next 6, 7, 8 days, did the people want to just go out and look at wildlife? Or?
Usually not. I mean, it would be, they might sit around camp and glass or something, but there was the whole attitude of, well, I get 15 days or 8 days left to, that isn't the way it usually works. Although the perception is I'm here for the experience and I love being in the outdoors. Most of the time, once they get the animal, if they could get on a plane the next day and leave, most of them would.
You didn't have any direct radio communication
No.
with charter service? Did you ever have any emergencies out there that were kind of timed?
The only one, no, not really. I guess I had one where the hunter broke his leg, and we had a radio then, but that was a marine radio, and on Kodiak that's what they used for a channel. And you had to have somebody flying over, and I was able to get a hold of a plane flying up Kodiak River. But that was the only one.
Your hunts in the Brooks Range, were they specifically for sheep, or did you hunt other species?
Sheep and moose primarily. We took a few bears, but over all the years we only took like 3 or 4 bears. But each year we would take a couple of moose usually, and we'd take some caribou. But primarily sheep.
Were they all rifle hunters? Did you
Yes.
have bow hunters?
I never had any bow hunters. Hunting with a bow is a lot, and guiding with a bow is different than guiding with a rifle. And I don't have the experience. I didn't have the experience to do that. So if I got an inquiry, I would send them someplace where they specialized in bows.
Did you have any assistants?
Usually not.
No camp cooks or anything like that?
No.
Okay.
Once in a while I'd have somebody help pack, but not as an assistant guide. One year I had a guy help me, Roy Jacobs helped me, but that was the only time. Very seldom. They get into that business of being arrogant, so arrogant as to think nobody can do it quite as well as, which isn't fair, but it's, you get into that situation. And from a hunter standpoint, hopefully you're in a better position to deal with these situations with the more experience that you have.
How many years did you guide total? When did you finish?
I finished in 2003 or 2004. I got my license in 64. 62 I got my assistant license. So 40-some years.
And did you continue up to the end, both on Kodiak and up in the Brooks Range?
Yes. But for the last 3 or 4 years I was in the Brooks Range, I was over on York Creek, not on the Shinjack.
Oh.
But that was only that's a 60-mile trip going in there, which it was one of the things I used to do was when I was traveling, when I was going in, is I'd think, where was I the day before yesterday? Well, 60 miles back's a long way. And then you think, well, where will I be the day after tomorrow if all goes well? Well, I'll be 60 miles the other way. And it really changes the perspective of the trip when you do that. But when I was going into York Creek, where will I be the day after tomorrow? I'll be there.
Did you ever have any issues with your horses or mules going in or out? I mean, in terms of health.
I lost a horse coming out one year, but other than that, no. I mean, they do pretty well in it. Of course, we're using mules, and mules operate a lot differently than what horses do, in that you don't have to have them tied together. And when they're able to run free like that, it really reduces the probability of having issues.
Did you do any trapping in the winter when you lived here in Fairbanks?
Just recreational trapping, like up Chena Hot Springs. I caught 10 or 15 wolves over all the years. But back in the 70s, it was a lot different then.
How so?
Well, there weren't as many people, and there weren't anybody trapping up there. I'd trap up along the road system, go up, I can't remember, Flat Creek, I think it was. A couple of other creeks up there. but it was just for wolves. I trapped one marten up there.
How'd you learn how to trap wolves?
I didn't. I just caught some. Yeah. Well, that's one of the things about trapping, that's really specific to the species. And I really saw that on Kodiak when I was trapping land otter. There's a real, I don't know, you become very specialized in it, and it's very specific to that species. And I assume that because of the people I've spoken to that are wolf trappers and people that trap marten and people that trap beaver. I'm always intrigued when I talk to somebody that's worked in a lot, how specialized these different animals are, these different species. That's why I answered that the way that I did. I caught some wolves, but I was a long ways from being a wolf trapper. Kind of like being a caribou hunter or something. I'm a long ways from being a caribou hunter or a goat hunter. And I learned after in '66, after we shot those two sheep, there was a goat that we kept seeing over on this mountain. So, and you didn't need tags then, so the hunter said he wanted to shoot that goat. So I said, well, we'll go over and get it. So I'm thinking, it can't be much different than a sheep. They're both white and they live in the mountain. So one of those looking back situations. So we got over there and we got within like 100 yards of that goat or something, which wasn't a real challenge. He shot and that goat went down. I said, that goat's dead. Every time I'd seen a sheep, which at that time I'd guided for like 15 or 16, whatever it was, and I was pretty much top of my game again, till I got to 30 or 40. But anyway, that goat went down just like that. I said, he's dead. I mean, it's flat made the comedy, he's dead. So I went one way and the hunter went the other because it was a little shorter and I wanted to get over to it. And I come around the corner and there's a goat standing there. Oh, damn, I didn't know there were two goats here. And finally it turned. And I could see the blood on it. So I ended up shooting it. But I shot that goat 3 or 4 more times before he was finally dead. It's just absolutely nothing like a sheep. Nothing.
I want to kind of take it back to like your time with the department, and you talked about Dan Reed and Sterling Miller and some of these guys that, weren't classically trained, but you got a unique education into research. What was your first computer, and what's your evolution of technology over the years?
My first computer was an Atari, and I don't remember what one it was now, but it was an Atari. And it had some sort of I don't even remember the data program that I had on it, but it was an old one. And I got some records from the department, and there were like 1,200 bear records. It was when I started on Kodiak, because we were looking at some skull data. And there were like 1,200 records in this, and it had skull width and skull length, but it didn't have total. I needed skull total. So I sat down and I go through and I had a little calculator and I'd add all those up and I'd put them in that column. Finally, I got almost done and that computer crashed. For like 4 or 5 days I was doing this. I mean, it was a long time. So it crashed and it was all gone. So Rob DeLong had just started here then. He hadn't been working very long. So I come down, I knew Rob because, so I went in, I was talking to him and explained to him my dilemma, and he said, go home, and if you can go home and you can write a formula in that and it'll do it. So I went home, wrote the formula, and was done in like 30 seconds. And then after that, my whole computer thing just it evolved, and I started using Lotus 123, and then DB3, and then with a lot of help from, in this case, Rob. He was once again, somebody from the department was able to get me started on it to where I could move on forward with it. And then I got a 386 40 megahertz machine, and I was king of the hill then. I was ahead of everybody down here for a little bit. But then processing the data, there was always somebody to help me through all, and there were plenty of them, rough spots. And everybody in this room knows how often I stop by with a brainstorm that sometimes, a lot of times it's deflated by the time, but at least it got me started on down the right track. And the department I can't overemphasize, I'll never be able to fully express how important that's been in the way I perceive my evolution in the field of wildlife management, in biology, statistics.
Have you come up with any interpretations that shed new perspectives on things that the department employees looked at and kind of maybe convinced some people there's another way to look at it?
I think probably, I'm always joking about it, but the sheep horn business, where, you know, there was a lot of concern about the age, about killing these sheep as soon as they get to be 8 years of age, and there was a momentum in place to change regulations on a statewide basis on that premise. And I think that the work that's been done, where we went through and demonstrated, I always like to say that if a sheep was 8 years old this year, it was 7 last. Yeah, has certainly changed the direction there, and from that it went to the degree of curl, which Brad and I and several other people have been working on, and that goes back to some of the work that Erickson and them did in the late '60s. The other thing I think is the importance of the historical aspect of a lot of this stuff, which tends to be overlooked. It's easy to get caught up in the moment and forget, like when they developed a timeline of sheep regulations. You know, those periods in the early in the last century when seasons were closed, in the 40s when there were 3 years with no season at all in the territory. That's not the perception today, and it wasn't the perception before the department newsletter, that sheep newsletter was developed. You know, and I think hopefully we're seeing, I think there are 6 proposals this time for sheep compared to what was it before? 20, 30. And with the public being educated or being made aware of this historical aspect of it, I think it's having an influence, an important influence. Because otherwise, when you go through and you look at it from a historical standpoint, it's the same, it's like a merry-go-round. It keeps turning and the same issues keep cropping up every X number of years. You know, they're not new.
How about your analysis of the bear data? I know we've had some conversations and you've taken some long looks at Kodiak and thought about other areas of the state after working with some of the other biologists. You think there's some room there for looking back historically at things?
I think so, and the other thing about that is, and it's not meant to be a criticism, but it's a concern certainly, that within the department especially, there's a tendency to compartmentalize these areas so that the area biologist on Kodiak really doesn't look at what's going on the peninsula. The biologist on the peninsula isn't really aware or doesn't look at what's going on Kodiak, and then neither one of them look at what's going on in southeastern from a historical perspective, and there's a potential value there, at least from a comparative standpoint, and that's all too often overlooked. And I don't think it's, I know that's specifically about bears, but there's a tendency to compartmentalize rather than reaching out, and that historical data is important. When you look at the historical data of that sheep harvest, you know, that when we compared with the structure of that harvest in 1950, it's very similar to what's being harvested now, both from an age standpoint and degree of curl as best we can figure it out. That was 1950, that's 70 years ago. So if we're going to look at the data today and think there's something askew or there's a problem, we need at least to reference that. And it may be the same with some of this survey data, but it's so piecemeal that it takes a real effort to consolidate it so that it can be used as a tool by different research people and management people from a historical standpoint.
Can you talk a little bit about your efforts in hunter education relative to particularly sheep and brown bear hunting, and if you think there's anything special there that you'd like to talk about?
For whatever reason, and I'm not sure, in the guiding industry, there's been this perception that you can't teach it. You can't teach hunting, which when I first heard that, when I was first exposed to it, to me it fell along the lines of when I first became associated with sheep hunting. One of the things that was often repeated as being fact was that sheep never skyline themselves. Well, and I'm thinking, if sheep never skyline themselves, how the hell do they get from one side of the mountain to the other? You know, it just doesn't make any sense. And it's the same with teaching hunting skills or some aspects of hunting. If you can't teach it, why? I mean, we teach everything else. That doesn't mean you can certainly provide the tools with which people can learn, but that wasn't the perception. So for whatever reason, I decided I was going to put together a course in sheep and brown bear hunting and something, you know, hunting in general. And I went to the university and developed a 1-credit course. And at that time we had Harvard graphics, I think it was, using for an overlay, and started to develop it. And to develop a system by which you can explain some of these basic principles. So that it doesn't make somebody a hunter, but it gives them the basic principles that they need to move on. You know, I often equate it to like a ladder. You know, you teach yourself to do anything. But in a lifespan or in a certain time frame, you're only going to get so far. And if you everybody starts off at the bottom of the ladder, everybody only gets to about the 3rd rung. But when you teach somebody or you supplement or you get started with information and you can start on the 2nd rung, then you can get to the 3rd or 4th rung. And if you learn from somebody that's at that 5th rung, then you can start off at the 4th. You don't have to go through this reinventing the wheel all the time. And that's what I think happens with hunting. And I saw that myself. I felt I saw that myself with the people that I was around hunting, like with Pennell and Tollefson. The things that I did and things that I modified, I didn't do things the same way they did. But I was able to modify them and make those changes because of what I learned from them. I didn't have to make all those, I made some of those mistakes again, but I didn't have to make all those mistakes over again and then go on. I was able to get to a point and then go on again. And I think that's what happens in the trades. We see that in trades. People make mistakes, they teach somebody else, and whoever you teach to do something will invariably develop a greater skill set than what you have at it. You see that in chess especially. Where you teach somebody to play chess, I don't care how good you are, whatever level you are, they will be better than you. They will be better than you because they're not going through that same process. They've learned those, and it's exactly the same thing with hunting. There are things that I spent a lot of time thinking about hunting that when you tell somebody about them, you see that in these classes that we give. You can see the wheels turning. When they get done, they start at a higher level than if they start off knowing zero. And I felt that's the same thing that's happened with me in the department. You know, I go in and talk to Sterling Miller. Well, I don't start off at Sterling Miller's level, I'm not saying that, but I don't have to make all the mistakes of somebody that's starting from zero going up. And these classes and the didactic material that's being, I like that word. I had to slip that one in. That's being developed by the department, I think demonstrate, when we look at the material I like to associate, you know, we're down to roughly 2% sublegal animals. And that's a decrease whether it's from 8 to 12. And I think that's directly attributable to the didactic material, I use the word again, that's been developed by the department. And that's another example of where when people learn things, they can kill sheep and finally figure it out or look at sheep, but when they have that material available to them, they don't have to. And from a resource standpoint, then there's no quote unquote, I hate to use the term, quicker way to put more sheep on the mountain than not to kill them. It's kill sublegal ones. You know? And that applies with any aspect. It doesn't matter whether it's packing horses or hunting sheep or stalking sheep. I remember spending 2 years because I was wrong. I was on a mountain and I was watching a bear that was over on a flat across a wide bay. And the way the wind was blowing, I didn't want to go over there. And the hunter wanted to, and I didn't want to. And I thought, well, maybe if I go over and I go around a certain way. Well, it was one of those cases where the wind was blowing across the bay and you have the white cap, so it doesn't take a mental giant to figure out which way the wind is blowing. And then this bear was up on this flat. And so there was no way that I could see we could get over there. But when I got over there, there was a bluff, a hard bluff. I'm going to say 100 foot, it's, 100, whatever it is, it's a steep bluff. When we got up on the front of that, up on the edge of that bluff, the wind was blowing in our face. It was blowing the opposite way it was on the ocean. That wasn't good, because that's not what I thought. And after a year, it took literally a couple of years to figure out that because of vortex effect of that wind on the face, that was important. Now that's 2 years that when you tell somebody that and you show it in a diagram, when they're planning a stock, they can incorporate it. But otherwise, you go through the process, and that's just one of a multitude of things. Weighing bears was the same way. That was one of those, well, the bear's 1,400 pounds, or it's God only knows whatever else. When we started weighing them, because it didn't make sense. Started weighing them because if you use a square, and you say a bear squares 9 foot, or it squares 10 foot, I'd have 100 shoot a 9.6, and then later on at that time they see an 8.6. You say, well, it's about 8.6, and they walk up to it, they'd be disappointed. Well, that's because there's only a foot difference there, but when you say that one bear weighs 900 pounds or 800 pounds and the other bear weighs 550 or 600 pounds, they understand that. That was what got me started weighing bears, because it's a better way to describe the relative size of two animals. So if you're looking at one that's pushing 10 feet, it's going to weigh about 800 pounds. Or, close 800 to 1,000. If you push one that's 900 pounds, 9 foot, and it's only going to weigh about 600 pounds. There's a hell of a difference between the two. But that's the kind of information you can pass on to people, and then they don't have to deal with that. They can deal with other issues, because God knows there's enough of them to work with. And I don't think it's any different in science. If everybody had to go out and start from the bottom, we'd never get anywhere.
A little aside there, I'm curious, how were you weighing those bears?
Usually I'd find like a mound, and then I had this heavy rope, and the thing was getting like the 6 feet that I needed. Not really. Cut them up into chunks. 50, 55 pound chunks. I like that one about standing up. No, cut them up and then for the hide, we figured 10% for the hide. And we weighed a couple of them, and that's what it came out. It's real close. Apparently that's pretty standard for mammals. The hide's about 10%.
So with respect to all your time and experience in the Brooks Range, when was it you learned that you have a drainage named after you up there?
Couple of years ago. It was funny because I'm out there, we're sealing away, and I see Joe Wantcrick on this thing. So of course now I have to call Tony, because I can't let that go by. So Tony comes out and he just rolls his eyes. But then I got to thinking about, that's a creek. There are mountain ranges, rivers, oceans, and I'm named after a creek. The only thing I could have, a rivulet would have been the only thing smaller I could have been named after. Huh?
Pup?
Pup?
Yeah. That's even like smaller than creek, right?
Oh, it is? Now see, let me write that down. I'll use that. That was horrible. At first I was elated, then I got to thinking, damn, that's the smallest unit I could have been named after.
It wasn't a relatively large creek, though, was it?
Well, it should have been a river then.
Yeah, exactly. Where is this relative to where you hunted?
Oh, I have no idea. Everybody when you go into an area, you name all these little dinky creeks and things. You have to, because otherwise there's no way to reference them. Usually the names are restricted or recognized within that camp itself. But I do know you never want to name it U Creek or something. You want to name it Big Ram Creek and something like that, because otherwise if you go up U Creek, and the hunters are all upset, why are we going up U Creek today? So you have to have a meaningful name, Record Book Ridge or something.
So you got 40 plus years of interacting with the department, and then you've seen different managers and different researchers. what are the differences you see today, or like, what's your vision of the future of the department? Do you think we're on a positive track?
Yes.
Or wildlife conservation's on the positive track? And what's the differences that you see old-time biologists compared to, you know, the new crop of biologists? Is there skills lacking, skills that need to be developed? Very open-ended.
Well, my overall impression is that everything is really going in a positive direction. There have been changes. I think that for the most part, the changes are good. There's an aspect of field time, which is important, and there may be less of that, which isn't good. I think that there has to be time spent in the field, and there's a tendency, and I'm not certain how it's going to be integrated, but the technology aspect of it, the ability to sit down at a computer and run this data is unbelievable. Things that, you know, sitting there with a piece of graph paper and a ruler graphing this out, being able to run it and look at the data from the standpoint of the computer is fantastic. But it's also important to be able to quantify that data with actual field observations. And the only way you can get those field observations is to be in the field. And I think that there's a tendency to reduce that amount of time for a variety of reasons. And I think that some of this research is extremely important, but there's a lot of basic work that needs to be done in the field and observations. And unless people can get in the field and do that, it really makes it difficult to interpret the data. And if there's a downside, there's this tendency to spend more time in front of the computer than in the field. And I think there's a tendency to rely too heavily on some of this technology. And I don't know how to balance that out. To spend 60 days on the Shinjek River watching sheep every day, there's a real benefit to that. And it could be in any, I just picked that because but as opposed to going up there and doing 2 surveys and not going back. And how that's balanced out, I don't know. But the people that I interact with, I think are fantastic. I thought they were fantastic 30 years ago. I see some changes in philosophy, but I don't know that they're bad. I see changes in my own philosophy, and I'd certainly be the last one to concede that they're bad. You know.
What are some of the changes in philosophy that are most striking to you?
I don't know, because what I've seen is evolved. You know, I mean, I've seen it evolve from predator control, which, you know, in the 50s, but by the time I became aware of it, it had already started to change. But from a historical standpoint, I know that the attitude towards predators was considerably different in the 40s than it was by the time I became associated, you know, aware of it in the 50s. And then it's evolved, and now it's sometimes I feel that there's at least part of it's evolving back the other way, where if we could just get rid of those pesky predators, then we would have sheep everywhere and we would have moose everywhere. And there's this, I don't know that there's a real good understanding of carrying capacity and what that really entails. You know, I mean, kind of like with Wayne has said sometimes, you know, we get these real high sheep populations, which are great, but then if you look at the underlying causes of it, where we have a disproportionate number of real old animals and disproportionate number of animals surviving on the other side that probably shouldn't have under normal conditions, that may not be as good as what we, you know, this abundance issue. And I'm not so certain that same thing doesn't carry over to like moose and some of these caribou populations. You know, I mean, I don't know if there's a real good understanding of that, at least from the standpoint of the general public, and to a lesser degree within the department. I think that there's I don't mean this as a criticism, but I think that I would like to see a more positive attitude on the part of the department about the good things that are being done. I think that there's a tendency to downplay, and it's kind of like there's always got to be a problem. And I think that may be changing some, but in the past, I think that's been the case. Regardless of how good things are, there's a problem. And I don't know that it always has to be that way. So that the public, I think sometimes they catch up, they sense that. And if people are in general saying, we're just not doing this right, then they start to sense that and they start to believe it. And I don't believe it's the case. When you look at like that map of wildlife management, the history of wildlife management that I have on my door, things were a lot worse in 1900 than they are right now. You look at the number of areas where we have seasons, you look at the sheep harvest, you look at all of these metrics, for the most part, look at the bear harvest on Kodiak, what those bears are doing there. Somebody's doing something is going right, and the department should be jumping in and claiming credit for it anyway. And I don't think that goes on. I'm going to use the term doom and gloom attitude. Sometimes it is. I don't think it's healthy for the department, and I know that it's not healthy for wildlife management.
Well, there's a couple more things I want to touch on. You talked about as a...
Just sitting here, little hands getting me in trouble.
Make sure that's still on, please.
Oh.
Does it say camera? Sorry.
Okay.
Does it say camera?
I think so.
Yeah, that's okay. I just want to make sure it wasn't shut off.
Oh, I was playing with it.
I know, that's why I didn't say anymore. Okay.
Well, man, we've worked for 4 years now together, so I've known quite a few of your stories, and I know that school, you weren't interested in, and you quit school, but it's obvious everybody interacts with you, like you have this insatiable curiosity, and you touched upon, you see an article in a newspaper, and you're curious about it, and you have I'm going to hitchhike to Anchorage to meet this professor and answer some questions. Can you tell a story about the time you built an airplane?
Oh, God. I was about 5 years old, and I decided I was going to build an airplane. So I go down to the creamery. Palmer was a colonist and, a colonial type. They had all the colonists came up there, and they had a creamery, and they had a regular general store. They had the power plant. It was a regular little city. And at the creamery, they used to have these. They were cardboard barrels that, like a 55-gallon drum. I don't know if they were that big, but they were like a 55-gallon drum. So I decided I was going to build an airplane, and I had one of these wind-up planes, the balsa wood. So I thought, well, I could build one of those. So I went down to the creamery. I was like 5, 6 years old. I went down and I rolled this barrel all the way home. It took me a long time. So I got it home, and I cut a hole in the top of it. And then I got a board and an inner tube, and I cut the inner tube and made like a big rubber band. Put that thing through there. And the next day, I put wings on it. I think I had one set of wings on it. So the next day, I'm going to wind this thing up, and I'm worried. That night, I could hardly sleep because I didn't know how I was going to wind it up and then let go and jump in the airplane before it took off. Now, this was a serious, serious thing. So the next day, I went out there, and I wound that damn thing up, and I got it all tight. I held onto that prop. I went to jump in the airplane. Prop never turned because it was pressed. But it was a problem that I spent a lot of time working on that wasn't really a problem at all. But my mind, it was like, I did that with a lot of things. It was like the wind. I reasoned that Palmer, the wind blew a lot. And when I was a little kid, I did not like the wind. But every time that wind would blow, those trees would sway. So I can remember driving along with my mom and dad thinking, if we cut down all these damn trees, there would be no wind. Because, and I tested it, I took a piece of paper or something, and you wave it like this, and when it moved, you could feel the wind. So I was able to reason. I shouldn't be telling all this. I reasoned that since that proved that those trees were causing the wind, if I cut them all down, the wind would be gone. Now, there would be people that say I haven't learned much since then, but
I think it just goes to show the tenacity you have going home every night and like thinking on a problem and until that one's solved and going to the next step.
Well, we went to that talk on Friday, which I really enjoyed, and then I was at a booth at the gun show this weekend, and the man next to me buys and sells ivory. He showed me a picture of a 13-foot tusk that weighed 200 pounds. So when we got to talking, he started talking about these Schrager lines, which is the way that they tell the difference. I didn't know about those. Did you? I didn't either. But I'll talk like I know all about it. But anyway, so I went home and looked it up, and that's the way they tell the difference between modern elephants and mastodon. One has an angle of 90 degrees or less, and the other has an angle of 120 degrees or more than 100 degrees. And I want to read some more about it, because I never know when I might have to tell the difference.
You mentioned to me one time that you had a grandmother that spoke French.
Yes, my grandmother was from France.
She was from France. What were the ethnicity of your parents?
My grandfather was German, and then my father was German, and my grandmother was French. It's French and German, as best as
You picked up the French language then?
Well, when I was real little, I spoke it quite a bit, I guess. And then when I was in school, I took French, and then I took a course when I was trapping one winter. I took a record course with me. Had a little record player with batteries in it.
I can remember when I worked out in the vault with you, helping you skin wolves one winter. You had a little record player like that, and you were teaching yourself how to play the harmonica.
Yeah, I learned to play the harmonica the same way.
Do you still play?
A little bit. But my wife says, oh, the only good thing about my playing the harmonica is I can't sing at the same time. But I enjoy the harmonica. I enjoy learning things. I enjoy the computer. That's what I enjoy about the computer, is learning things. Different programs, learning to do different things on different programs. Especially with YouTube.
Yeah.
Any further questions?
Well, Joe, is there anything else about your career, about whether it be guiding or as you transitioned into research here in the department that you'd like to touch on?
Well, the only thing I can say is, you and I have touched about it a little bit, is I really am happy with the life that I have been able to live. And I'm really happy with the people that I have been able to associate with, both in the department, on the guiding side and on the department side as well. Because it's been, every once in a while I'll sit there and I'll think, we've talked about this before, where one little event in your life and you wouldn't be where you are today. And I am really, really happy with where I am today, to the point that sometimes I don't get scared and cry about it, but you think about it, if one thing had gone just one way different, then you'd be somewhere else. And I really can't think of any place else that I would rather be, both from a professional standpoint, what I was able to do guiding, what I've been able to do interacting with the department, and just all of these other aspects of my life. I'm just really happy with myself. I'm serious, which one of the sad things, I guess, was every once in a while I'll run into somebody who'll say, man, I wish I would have done this, or I wish I would have done that. And sometimes I don't know whether feel sorry is the right term, but I think I'm really happy that I don't have to say that. I was really glad I went in the service. I made some mistakes, shock, some decisions that would have been better. But I was really happy with going in the service. I was really happy with my guiding career, what I was able to do guiding, where I was able to go, things I was able to do. I've really been happy with my ability to interact with different people at the department. It's just, I'm really happy with my marriage. I like where I live. I like my stuff in the yard. And I've been fortunate enough to have good health. I had a kidney op, but that was trivial compared to, what a lot of people go. So I mean, it's just pretty hard for me to not be happy,
And you're a master gardener too.
Well, I'm with mules on the place for 40 years. It's hard not to be.
Well, any further questions? Thank you, Joe.
No, well, I really appreciate the time to.
That was awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Joe.
I just wish I
We just scratched the surface is a sad thing.
I forgot to turn the cameras on, but
Oh well. Yeah. They may be off after I played with this thing.
Thanks a lot.
No, thank you.